Time to discuss the latest and look back at the most important topics of today's show, including the latest from Ukraine, the Middle East, and Hungary, with my guest, William B. Taylor, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, who joins me on World News Tonight. Ambassador, thank you so much. Pleasure to have you back with us.
Thank you, Claudia. Good to be here.
So, Ukrainian forces, as we know, targeted Transneft oil terminal at the port of Primorsk. They also targeted refinery in Ufa. Do you think that Ukraine's strategy to, quote, bring the war back to Russia is actually going to make Russia feel the consequences of the conflict they wage? Are attacks like these making a tangible difference in Russia's wartime economy? What's your opinion?
I think they are, Claudia. I think the Ukrainians have now actually fired. This recent barrage was larger than the ones that the Russians fired against Ukraine. That is, Ukrainians are firing more at Russia than the Russians are firing at Ukraine. And that is bringing the war home to the Russians. Absolutely. It is also damaging their oil infrastructure. The Ukrainians go after military targets, oil targets that fund the war, fund the Russians' ability to fight this war. So yes, I think it's having a real effect, and I think the Russians are now fearful of these attacks.
U.S. and Ukrainian officials met in Miami for the second day of peace talks aimed at brokering some sort of peace deal with Russia. But as I said, it was Ukraine and U.S. officials. Is this just another meeting as usual? I mean, with the conflict in the Middle East, is it possible that these meetings actually take Ukraine closer to possible peace?
Well, I think what we see, Claudia, is the Ukrainians and the Americans continuing to coordinate closely. And what we see is the Russians are not interested. The Russians are not interested in these peace. As you've indicated before, Putin seems to just want to draw this out. He thinks he can somehow win this war by grinding through. Turns out he's losing an incredible number of soldiers. The Ukrainians are now pushing back, in particular in the southern part of the line, and are taking back territory from the Russians. So the Ukrainians are definitely not losing, and the Russians are definitely not winning. So the battle there is going to be for the description of how this work goes on. The conversations between the Americans and the Ukrainians are important to continue, but the Russians seem not to be interested in these negotiations.
We also know that Ukrainians are not only fighting on their battlefield. 200 experts, this is how many experts Ukraine sent to the Middle East to aid those countries that were being attacked by Iran. Do you think that this expertise that Ukraine is willing to share with America's allies in the Middle East is actually going to work in favor of Ukraine when it comes to that relationship, building a stronger, more sustainable relationship with the U.S. when it comes to those peace negotiations and U.S.'s position towards Russia?
I do, Claudia. I think it is very clear, becoming clearer by the day, that the Ukrainians do have cards. The Ukrainians know how to defend against these Iranian Shahed drones. The Ukrainians have learned over the past 4 years that they've been fighting the Russians how to defend, how to defeat these drones. And the Ukrainians are now sharing this information, not just the hardware, but also how it works, what the whole network looks like, how to defeat these drones that are coming from Iran. The Ukrainians know how to defeat them because the Russians have been using them against them for 4 years. So yes, I think this demonstrates that Ukraine is an asset. Ukraine is able to provide security for themselves, and they're willing to share it with the United States and U.S. allies.
Mm-hmm. Let's take a moment to actually move to the Middle East and the latest. President Trump announced postponement of power plant strikes in Iran after apparently there was a conversation between the U.S. and Iranian officials, but Tehran denies such allegations. How do you read into this? Is this a misunderstanding? Is the U.S. trying to play for time, perhaps, when it comes to the situation in the Middle East? How do you read into this?
I'd be willing to bet that there are conversations going on. I'd be willing to, I suspect they're not direct face-to-face conversations between Americans and Iranians. But I think the Iranians are talking to, let's say, the Egyptians or the Omanis. And the Americans are talking to the Egyptians and the Omanis. or the Pakistanis. There are intermediaries that are facilitating these conversations, and I'm prepared to believe that there are these conversations. I think President Trump does want to end this war. This is not how he thought it was going to be. He would like to get this over. The economic consequences of this war are not good for the West, for the United States, and he wants to end this war. So having conversations, even indirect conversations through intermediaries, makes good sense.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the U.S. and Israel are on the same page when it comes to wanting to end this war and having those ceasefire discussions with Iran?
Probably not. Probably not. I imagine the Israelis are more interested in regime change. They want to get rid of these mullahs, get rid of this regime. Whereas these conversations, these indirect dialogue between the Americans and the Iranians suggest that the Americans are willing to deal with this regime. So I think that the interests between the Israelis and the Americans starting to diverge.
Mm-hmm. I promised that we will talk Hungary in our interview as well. So Hungary, it seems like, I would say, a baffling conundrum. Why do you think that both President Trump and Vladimir Putin support the leader that effectively is making things harder for Ukraine and making things harder for Europe when it comes to peace on the continent?
You're right. It makes no sense, Claudia. Putin, we understand why Putin wants Orban to win. Orban has been a supporter of Russia. Putin, he has been the opponent of Ukraine, opponent of the EU, for that matter. So we can understand why Putin wants to support him. Cannot understand why President Trump wants to support him. It makes no sense. It is very clear that the foreign minister, that the Hungarian foreign minister has been in direct conversation, even during direct conversations in Brussels, passing on information, maybe getting instructions from the Russians on how to respond. This is not an ally. Hungary is not an ally of Europe, should not be an ally of the United States.
I'm very happy that you mentioned Hungarian Foreign Minister Péter Szijjártó, because he stands accused of allegedly sharing sensitive EU information with Moscow. Is Hungary now truly a full-blooded Trojan horse for Europe?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Hungary is the problem for Europe, not the only problem, but the main problem. It's a big problem for the United States, even though the United States administration seems to be supporting Orban. And again, that may change. And what really matters, of course, is what the Hungarian people want. If the Hungarian people want to align themselves with Europe, then they will express that next month in these elections. If they want to align themselves with Russia, they remember, the Hungarians probably remember what it was like under the Russian Soviet thumb. So we'll see what happens in those elections.
Mm-hmm. You're a diplomat with many years of experience. In your opinion, what do you think what the EU should do? What should be EU's next step if they manage to get their hands on an evidence that chief Hungarian diplomat revealed the sensitive information to Russia?
It's certainly not for Americans to tell Europeans how to deal with a problem that is in their ranks. But the Europeans know how to deal with Hungary. And they've got some ideas about reducing the influence, removing subsidies going to Hungary. The Europeans know how to deal with this, and I have great confidence that Brussels will figure that out.
Ambassador, thank you so much for joining me on our show tonight. It's a pleasure, as always, to have you back.
Claudia, thanks for having me.
William B. Taylor, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, was my guest on the show. And so this would be all for now. All the latest news. I'm Klaudia Czerwińska. Thank you for joining me here, and I hope to see you back here on TVP World for more. But until then, good night.